Welcome to NPR TV. NPR standing for Understanding Porsche Revs. Tonight we're going to discuss something that is very near and dear to my heart. Overrevs. Now many of you might be expecting this to be a very riveting topic, and you'd be right. Okay, not really, but it'll at least be a lot better than sifting through a lot of misinformed internet posts and data that you can't interpret without the help of an expert. I'm going to be your expert tonight, and we're going to look at some data, some illustrations, and take some test drives to actually see what these elusive DME reports mean. So stick with us, and you'll learn way more than you ever wanted to know about Porsche Overrevs. So we're going to talk about overrevs, and they're technically ignitions, but they happen at an overspeed range. So we're going to illustrate what that actually means. So a lot of people say, well, the car has 2,000 overrevs. That means it's been over redline 2,000 times. Not at all. That means the spark plug is fired 2,000 times. So let's go with a number easy to divide, and let's say there's 33 range ones. That does not mean there's 33 overrevs, it's 33 ignitions. Every time the crankshaft goes around, you have 3 spark plugs that fire. So 33 divided by 3 would be 11. 11 revolutions in that specific rev range. So if you figure that the average redline on a Porsche is somewhere around 7,000 RPM, that means that there's 7,000 revolutions happening per minute. So if you figure 11 of those were in that particular range, that, just doing the math in my head, equates to, hold on, I gotta figure out the math here, 0.09 seconds spent at redline. So this number is tiny. It's basically one blip off the rev limiter. You're gonna have way fun editing this. Now another thing we need to look at is not just the number of overrevs, but how long since they occurred. So if you look at the number over here, we'll say this is at 380.7 operating hours, and the total is 752 operating hours. A number of people do this math wrong and say that this is the number of hours since it occurred. That's not correct. This is the hour at which the overrev occurred, and this is the total hours. So you subtract this number from the total to get the time since that range occurred. Now Porsche says in their CPO criteria that an overrev has to have occurred at least 200 hours prior to be eligible for CPO if it is in the higher ranges where it would not otherwise be eligible. So we're talking range 4, 5, and 6. So as long as it was 200 hours ago, no big deal. No damage has occurred. But you can get a picture of how the car has been used, not foolproof, by looking at the total number of overrevs in each range. Now this varies between models because the 997 GT3 and RS and those models only, range 1 is not actually redline, it's 9,000 RPM. Redline is 8,400. So range 1 is 600 RPM over redline, and we're going to demonstrate that in a little bit. Every other model, range 1 is redline. So for example, on a 997 GT3, you'll see readouts like this, and that would be considered normal. On a 997 Turbo, you might see a whole bunch through range 4, and that's actually considered normal, especially on a turbo because the boost will continue to push the car past redline if you have your foot on the throttle and force a mechanical overrev without downshifting. So let's look at a 997 Turbo and delineate that. So 997 Turbo has a redline at 6,800. So this is a range 1. The ranges are then every 200 RPM past that. So we got range 2, range 3, and then range 4. And range 4 is 7,400 to 7,900. Whereas on a 997 GT3, this is range 1. So we're not even approaching a range 1 where we're already registering range 5s on a 997 turbo. So you can see why their readouts are going to be vastly different. Also, these motors have been tested to 9,500 RPM in the Cup cars. So some overrevs in these ranges really aren't a big deal. It's a friggin' Metzger motor. They're basically bulletproof. Now the other thing that will have happen is on turbos, guys will put in an ECU tune that will often bump the redline. So if we say the original redline is 6,800, it's common to bump it to 72 or 7,300 as the new redline. So if you're going through the gears, get into boost, you're going to be hitting range 2s every single time you upshift, unless you're a pansy. If you look at some 996 turbo readouts that have had an EVOMS tune or similar, you're going to see a ton of range 1 and range 2s. And that doesn't mean the car's been tracked or abused, it just means it's got a tune and it's been driven. Now let's go back to the 997 GT3 for a second. Redline's 8,400, range 1 is 9,000. A lot of people will look at GT3 DMEs and say, well, it's got 0 overrevs, it's never been tracked. Totally false. All that means is nobody's ever downshifted early. I've personally tracked the piss out of numerous GT3s that had perfectly clean DME readouts. So you can't judge a GT3 exclusively by the readout. The other interesting fact is that these DME readouts can actually be tampered with. It's extremely difficult. I've only seen it happen once where I had hard evidence, and I don't actually know how it's done, but I know that somebody within Porsche has to have a hand in it. For example, I had to have an instrument cluster coded one time because it was being replaced. It was coming from Canada, so it was switching from metric to English units. In order to do this, they had to be online with Porsche in Germany, and it took the Porsche dealer even like a couple days to figure out and get approval for and everything like that. So it's not something that anybody with a Durametric or P-Wiz could do. So in order to reset the overrevs, it's got to take somebody who knows a lot and probably Porsche's approval from Germany. So I don't think it's very easy to do. Like I said, I've only seen it once, so I wouldn't be overly concerned about that. But one thing you can check is how many programming operations a DME has had. So at the bottom of a DME readout, often it'll say programming operation 01, 02. 01 is the initial program from the factory. Any number above 1 is programming operations after that fact. However, again, that's not conclusive because I've seen numerous cars with 2 or 3 programming operations because they were in the dealer for something. Some cars had a DME recall where they had to be reset. If you do a tune, often that can affect that. So again, it's not foolproof, but it's just something to keep your eye out for. So let's take a look at 996 DME readouts. These really aren't overly helpful in determining whether or not a car's had a money shift because there's only 2 ranges. And range 1 is redline, and range 2 can be anywhere from 400 to 600 over redline as a base, and then it's to infinity and beyond. So a range 2 could be 7,800 RPM, or it could be 10,000 RPM. Really no way of knowing. So what's helpful on these, obviously if it has no range 2s, that's fantastic, but most cars, especially the 996 turbos, are going to have range 2s. So you just want to take a look at how many they have in the ranges versus the hours and evaluate it on that basis. Now the interesting thing on these too is, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but that is the maximum number of overrevs that a DME will record. Now on the 997s, it will actually reset and start back at 1. So you'll see some interesting phenomena. Well, you probably won't, I've never seen it. But on the 996, I've actually seen this maxed out numerous times. Again, that in and of itself isn't that big of a deal because doing the quick math in my head once again, that equates to a whopping 120 seconds or just over 3 minutes at redline. And in the grand scheme of things, that's really not that much. If you have 50,000 miles on a car, that's nothing. But what can give you an idea of how the car was driven is looking at the number of range 2s. Because I've seen cars that had these maxed out, but only had a couple hundred range 2s. What that tells me is somebody knows how to shift, because it basically shifted at redline and never went over. However, on turbos, and especially if they have a tune, you might see 40,000 range 2s. That probably indicates the car's been driven just a little bit more aggressively. So how do you actually determine if a car's had a money shift or not, and whether or not it matters? Well, as we discussed earlier, the amount of time elapsed since the shift happens definitely matters. If it was 20 hours ago, there may be engine damage. If it was 2,000 hours ago, who friggin' gives a crap? I passed on a 997 GT3 one time because it had a previous misshift that was shown on the ECU. And I actually called the original owner and he confirmed, yep, I was driving it on the highway one time, went from third to second, and you know, it registered some range 5s. And stupidly, I passed on the car, even though it was a good car otherwise, because I was too concerned about the DME readout. Somebody else bought it, got a great car, and there were no issues with it because it had happened like 10,000 miles ago. I've seen some DME readouts that look like this. And I actually had a car attempted to be returned one time because they said it had high range overrevs. And I countered that there's no possible way that you could have one ignition in 3 different ranges. Probably pretty tough to have one ignition in one range at all. So this whiskey was aged in oak. Oh, I'm sorry, back to the video. So as we determined earlier, doing the calculations, one ignition would be fractions of a thousandth of a second. So to have multiple of those in different ranges just can't happen. Now in Porsche's CPO guidelines, they do state that single ignitions in multiple ranges can be disregarded. However, I've also seen one like that, where it had 3 of the same number, still a single digit but not 1. To have a fraction of a thousandth of a second in 3 different ranges, especially on a GT3 when this is like 10,000 RPM, it just can't happen. The engine's moving too quickly to record that few ignitions. So to give you an illustration, I'll make a diagram of an actual misshift so you can see what it looks like. A car that's been driven quite a bit and had a number of optimistic downshifts, we'll say, and then you'll see a decreasing number like this. And if you were to draw it out, it would be a bell curve like that. And that's what an actual misshift would look like. You have an increasing number of ignitions as the engine is slowing down, which makes sense. All that said, not all DME readouts are created equally. You have to actually consider the type of car you're buying, the total miles on it, any potential mods, and that will give you a pretty complete picture of how the car was driven, but really not a complete picture at all. So, for example, we'll look at kind of the typical readouts you might expect to see, and these are all good readouts, acceptable in my book, which my book's the only one that counts anyway. So you have a 996 GT3. You'll certainly see some range 1s because, again, that's redline, and you'd hope to see no range 2s, although I would not discount a car with range 2s. 996 Turbo, you'll usually see quite a number of range 1s and certainly range 2s, again, especially if it's been tuned. 997 GT3, I would hope to see very few range 1 through 3 because, again, this is over redline. So I see a lot with 0s in all ranges, but I will not discount a car with some range 1 through 3s. Range 4s and 5s, I'd have to evaluate individually based on the car, how long ago it occurred, how the car was driven otherwise, and what records were in place. 997 Turbo, you'll certainly see quite a few up through 4 and even 5. Again, not concerning. This is the typical readout I see on a 997 Turbo. 997 or 987, again, this is redline, so you'll typically see quite a number at redline, maybe some even in range 2, but you'd hope to not see any in 3, 4, 5, 6. Otherwise, the car was really shifted aggressively. So I hope that helps. We're going to do a demonstration. We're going to show you some readouts on screen along with this, and we're going to take a couple cars for a drive to show you what actually happens. Said anything about scanning your computer while you're driving. Fast and the Furious!
I'm tuning the nitrous, putting nitrous.
To prove once and for all that Redline is not a range 1 on a 997 GT3, we're going to take one out. So we've got a before durometric scan. We've got 28 ignitions in range 1. Pretty much nothing. Nice, healthy scan. So we're going to take this for a spirited ride now that the oil temperature is up to proper operating. And we'll go for a spin. Now here we go. We're going to actually hit that elusive Redline, 8,400 RPM. All you need. Oh my goodness, it's a miracle. There's still 28. So there you have hard proof that hitting the rev limiter on a 997 GT3 will not trigger range 1 ignitions on the DME. So now the question is, how many ignitions does one bounce off the rev limiter cause? So we can get kind of a picture of how many times off the rev limiter a certain number of ignitions are. So we're going to start with this 996 GT3, which has 2,177 range 1s. Nothing. And we're going to go out, hit the rev limiter, oh my goodness, and see how many it registers after once. You know what that's from, right?
No!
It's Seinfeld! How do you not remember that?
That sounds right.
Come on! He's scratching his nose. I'm scratching. No, it wasn't a pig. No! See what you can do with no traction control? You can scare your cameraman. Alright, ready. I think we might break the internet if this happens, or at least Renless servers will go down. We're gonna give a Porsche purist a heart attack. So after that unholy moment, we have a whopping 2,220 range 1s. So there you have it. One touch of the rev limiter, 33 ignitions. Not 33 overrevs, not 33 times at the rev limiter, but one blip, 33 ignitions. So what does all this mean anyway? What do all these numbers and data have to do with buying a GT3? Well, they're a good tool. They're really not everything. The DME report doesn't make a car. If I were to give you a stack of DME readouts and told you to go find the car based on the information on the readout, you probably could. You might get one or two right, but there's not always a correlation between a high amount of overrevs and an abused car, or one that appears abused anyway. Same thing if I gave you a Carfax report and said, oh, let's find the car based on the Carfax. You probably couldn't. And really, if you're standing here and you're looking at two nearly identical cars, and one is a 5-owner car and one is a 2-owner car on Carfax, which one are you going to buy? You're going to buy the cleaner car. That's what you're going to buy. And same thing with the DME readouts. They are a good tool, just like Carfax, but they're not everything. Same thing with a pre-purchase inspection. Some people require that it has to be at a Porsche dealer. Some people require that it has to be at an independent. Nobody's right, because a PPI is ultimately only as good as the tech that's performing it. I've seen absolutely atrocious PPIs from Porsche dealers that weren't worth the paper they were written on. So all these things are just helpful tools in creating a picture of the car that really can't be replaced by just going to see the car, driving it, and understanding what the car is. That being said, if you don't know what to look for, if all you see is shiny colored paint and hear an intoxicating noise of a Metzger, I can understand that. Not everybody is an expert in judging cars even after driving them. So in that case, sometimes it's helpful to hire an expert who knows what they're doing around GT3s, who's driven hundreds of them, who's interpreted DME readouts. I don't know anyone like that, but you know, if you find somebody like that, you should probably call them and hire them to help you out in your search for a GT3 or turbo or other specialty Porsche. So ultimately, there's no foolproof system when buying a car, but you will encounter many tools.